My understanding is that the more radical voices on the climate amelioration front presume that it's simply impossible for upcoming generations of people in the West, and certainly people in the developing world, to aspire to anything even approximating the standard of living that we currently enjoy. They should bloody well get used to having less, and the sooner the better. And so the fact that young people are being priced out of the housing market, let's say, and face a more uncertain economic future in some ways looks to me like a feature, not a bug. It's something that's actually part of the plan. If your viewpoint is fundamentally Malthusian, you think, well, human beings will multiply until there's far too many of us, catastrophe as a consequence, which is pretty simple-minded biological modeling. You're going to assume that everything has to be oriented towards placing extremely severe constraints on growth, and if that means impoverishing people now, while you're forestalling some hypothetical future catastrophe, and that's entirely justifiable. And it seems to me we're running down that road as fast as we possibly can, with moral flag firmly in air, saying to young people and the developing world, well, we had it pretty good, but we probably burned up more than we should have, and I think it's time for you guys to pay. I don't buy any of that, because I don't think the limits to growth model is biologically appropriate in the least, because human beings aren't yeast in a petri dish by any stretch of the imagination. And I think that the idea that we need to impoverish the poor and the young to save the planet is not only morally reprehensible and arrogant, but will also produce a far worse planet on the environmental front. I don't exactly understand why people are buying into this with such avidity, because there's no evidence whatsoever that is producing the results that are intended even by the people who are pushing forward the policies. It's a partial pseudo-religion. I mean that technically. I'm going to write about this to some degree, and I'm writing a new book which will come out in November called We Who Wrestle with God, and I'll cover that in this. But Alex Epstein, who wrote Fossil Fuel Future recently, comments about this a bit. So the basic structure of the quasi-religious belief, and so this is the set of initial presumptions. That's a way of thinking about it. We were talking about how ideas are structured earlier. The Marxists believe that everything's about power. There's a narrative at the base of any belief system, and the climate pseudo-religion is based on characterization of nature as something like a hapless, defenseless, fragile virgin. The industrial activity of mankind is characterized as something like a rapacious, power-mad demolisher of natural virginity and beauty, and then the human being the individual is characterized as nothing but a devouring mouth whose activity runs contrary to the untrammeled beauty of the planet and that supports the activity of the tyrannical patriarchy. That's basically it. The reason that narrative has force is because it draws on underlying religious archetypes. And so to characterize the world properly, you do need to characterize the positive aspect of nature, because you have to live in something approximating a reciprocal harmony with nature. Because if you just eat everything and devour everything in your local landscape, then you die. So that's a bad idea. So you have to have some sense of the value of nature. Now, you also have some sense of the fact that if you were dropped in the jungle naked in the Amazon, you'd be dead in about 48 hours. So you also need a figure to characterize the negative element of nature, and that's completely absent from the environmental myth. That's part of what makes it pathological. With regard to the rapacious tyranny, let's say, any industrial system or any human organization can exploit the natural world to the point where that's not sustainable, and it can become oppressive and tyrannical. That's the evil king, ancient part of religious mythology going back as far back as we can chase it. You need a representation of the negative aspect of society, because you send your kids to school and they kind of get turned into these cookie cutter kids, and that crushes their innate difference and beauty, and it's all the pain of having to be socialized. You have to understand that there is this oppressive element of culture. But then, you should also wake up and notice that you've got the wise king too, and that means you plug in your damn toaster in the morning and the electricity works, and you go out on the street and everyone isn't rioting, and there's workmen who are knee deep in the sludge trying to keep everything going, and you're not starving to death like everybody on the planet was in 1860. And so a little gratitude for the positive end of the patriarchy is in order too. And
That's completely absent in the environmental view. With regard to the individual, it's like, well, of course you can be a selfish, impulsive, hedonistic consumer, and you can facilitate the rapacious tyranny as a consequence of that, rape the planet. But by the same token, we're not a cancer on the face of the earth. We're not a virus that's mutating and taking out the planet, and we're not trapped in a Malthusian nightmare. And you got to give credit where it's due. And, there's an element of people, of everyone, that's noble and generous and kind and productive and capable of living in a well-ordered state in something like sustainable and productive harmony with nature. You only get half that story. If you have no comprehensive underlying cultural narrative, which is increasingly the case in our society, and someone offers you when you're a teenager half the religious story, that'll just snap you up in a second because it helps you order your relationship with the world. It gives you a pathway too, eh? So Jean Piaget, the great developmental psychologist, he called the last stage of adolescence the messianic period, the messianic stage. Now, most people don't talk much about that, I think, because they don't know what to make of Piaget's claim, but he was a real genius. When you're making that transition from the group identity that you're chasing as a teenager to becoming an individual, journey everyone takes, because lots of people just get lost in group identity, you're going to be looking for a pathway that's essentially heroic. What that pathway should be is that you identify with your culture deeply, are socialized deeply into the traditions of your culture, but you're also capable of transcending it. So then you become a culture creator as well as a disciplined member of culture. But young people need to be offered something like a vision of destiny in order to catalyze their identity. And we're very, very bad at that, except on the ideological front. So the woke types come along and say, the planet's a virgin, the great father's a tyrant. You could be a hero if you just stood up to that. And the kids think, well, I'd like to do something important with my life. And so they're just caught into that immediately. But because it's a one-sided story, there's an idea that the only acceptable natural landscape in some real sense is one that's been completely untouched by human beings. And so if that's your presupposition to begin with, then anything that has to do with industry is going to be, let's say, persona non grata. If you combine that with this Malthusian notion, which we could go into a little bit. So the Malthusian notion, for everyone watching and listening, it's based on something like a Petri dish model. So a Petri dish is an enclosed plastic container that has a medium in it, often agar, which is a kind of gelatin that you can grow microorganisms on. And if you throw a microorganism in there, it'll start to multiply until it eats up all of the agar, and then it'll all die. And so there's this idea that's in some sense a biological idea that populations left to their own devices will multiply until they devour all their resources, and then they will perish en masse. The Malthusian predictions of population collapse that started to emerge in the 60s were based on this Petri dish model in some real sense. And the problem with that model is that it isn't obvious that single-celled organisms are a good metaphor for human beings because we're capable of extremely radical adaptation and transformation, whereas single-celled organisms just basically run out something like an algorithmic program, even though they're quite complex. And so the notion that human populations are destined to a Malthusian end is not, what would you call it? It is not a canonical biological fact. If you believe the carbon dioxide climate catastrophe narrative, you could make a case that it's ethically required to impoverish people if you could demonstrate that that impoverishment actually produced, let's say, a decrease in carbon output. But that certainly isn't what's happened in Germany since Germany's gone madly green. In fact, their energy production is much less efficient than it was 10 years ago, and it's 5 times as expensive, and it pollutes far more. And so my sense is that, and I think the data bear this out too, is that if you provided people with cheap, clean energy on a world basis and eradicated absolute poverty, or at least ameliorated to the degree that was possible, then people start caring about the long term and they start working for environmental preservation at a local level. And that's a far more effective way of taking care of the planet. I read that the putative contribution of carbon dioxide to global warming is less than the margin of error for measurement of the effect of water vapor. We're planning on spending $2 trillion to remediate a problem whose magnitude is so small that it could easily be hidden within another measurement error on the water vapor front. From what I'm able to understand, and this is fairly basic, is that because energy sits at the base of everything we do, because there's no difference in some real sense between energy and work, and there's no difference between work and even minimal human flourishing, shelter, opportunity for your kids, provision of inexpensive and plentiful food, the fundamental basics. Yep. Every time we make energy more expensive, what we do is we tilt hundreds of millions of people who are just starting to struggle their way out of absolute poverty right back into desperate scrabbling around in the dirt, fundamentally. You might say, well, that's absolutely necessary because of limits to growth. The planet just can't tolerate the multitude of people striving for economic security that are currently engaged in that struggle. And so tough luck to those people. But the thing that really bothers me about that, apart from the fact that it's cruel beyond belief, is that I don't see any evidence at all that tipping hundreds of millions of people back into absolute poverty is going to do anything but make the planet a hell of a lot worse. The situation in Germany is quite illustrative of that now, because we've got a perfect storm in Germany, as far as I can tell. We've got dependence on a dictator, Putin, or on petro-dictators, because Germany, for example, has just made a big deal with Qatar because Canada sent them away empty-handed. And then energy costs are extremely expensive in Germany, and so lots of industrial enterprises are leaving, going to places like China and the US. And then also the entire power structure is now incredibly unreliable, and it's more polluting by a large margin than it was 15 years ago. I don't even think that this is based on politics per se. I think what happens to these leaders, and I've seen a fair bit of this in Canada, and I know about it firsthand, and in the US for that matter, is that people get inflamed about a particular issue because they're afraid, let's say climate change, and then the politicians who have very little courage on the electoral front use very, very badly designed public opinion polls to sample people's terror at the level of whim, and then they pander to it. And I don't think that that's necessary, because I don't think there's any evidence at all that that kind of public opinion poll driven pandering is a reasonable short, medium, or long-term political solution. Well, it's reasonable to be concerned about the environment. Part of the environment is climate. Part of climate is carbon dioxide. Maybe we should just focus on carbon dioxide, and then we're doing the right thing. And that's where people get led down the garden path, because you don't get to be a planetary savior by jumping up and down and saying carbon dioxide is bad. That's too oversimplified, and the politicians capitalize on that. I think it's absolutely unforgivable for the West to ever say anything about whether or not the developing countries, and that would include China and India, have any right to start moving away from wood and dung, which also kill many, many people while they're burning, toward coal and natural gas and nuclear. I've been trying to follow along, let's say on the psychological front, trying to piece this together. It's something like pay now or pay later. Sure, many, many people are going to suffer if we raise energy prices and put on limits to growth, but that will be nothing compared to the suffering of people 50 to 100 years down the road if we don't take emergency action now. That if you're putting forward a scientific hypothesis that's testable and falsifiable, it's incumbent upon you to specify the appropriate time frame. You don't get to say the human race is heading for an uncontrollable Malthusian catastrophe sometime in the next 10,000 years. It's like you can just go away with those ideas. If you can't specify the damn time frame, then you should shut the hell up. You would soon have all the money. And I don't see anybody who's developing these very complex models who has all the money. So I don't think that they can make models that can model the behavior of systems that complex. The ocean's pretty damn deep, and it's not like we can measure everything that's happening in the ocean. I can't imagine we understand long-term current flows from the depths well enough to be predicting climate alteration on the scale of a few degrees. That just strikes me as unbelievably preposterous. And then I also
learned, and this was also shocking, that there's a very positive relationship between GDP and environmental, let's call it awareness and concern. So it looks like once you get people up to about the point where in their country the average GDP is $5,000 per person, people can stop scrabbling around in the dirt and burning everything and eating everything in sight, and they can start to think about what sort of environment they'd like to have for their children. And so then I thought, oh well, isn't this interesting? What this should mean is that if we wanted to, we could work really hard internationally to make energy cheap, and we could pull billions of people, the remaining people in the world, out of abject poverty. And the consequence of that, they would start to become locally concerned about environmental maintainability and sustainability, and then everyone would have enough to eat and they'd all be educated, plus the planet would be better off. And then the question was, why the hell aren't we doing this? It's like instead we're buying this crazy apocalyptic narrative that's making the planet worse, that's driving energy costs up, that's destabilizing us sociopolitically, when, as far as I can tell, the pathway forward to abundance and sustainability is pretty damn obvious, and also not particularly expensive. One of our problems is that because we're sensitive to negative information, and because there's always a potential apocalypse bubbling away in the background, it's very hard for us to distinguish collectively between threats that are valid apocalyptically and those that aren't. And then we tend to err on the side of panic, let's say. And that wasn't such a bad thing when our responses weren't as large as the potential problems, because now what happens is that if we stampede in one direction, we're so powerful that the bloody stampede can be much worse than the problem. We're also not that good, particularly now, adopting, say, a few centuries long time frame. And it's not surprising because we don't live that long. But I mean, if you look at medieval Europe, there was the capacity for sustained imagination. So a lot of the great cathedrals, which were amazing engineering projects for their time, were construed over multiple centuries. People who started them knew they wouldn't finish them. So there was that sense of long-term continuity. But maybe one of the byproducts of a very efficient and hyper-productive capitalist society is that we tend to have a shorter time frame for expectation of results. One of the things I wonder about is why this idea that human beings are in some sense in their activity antagonistic to the earth. It's a very peculiar metaphysical assumption, especially for people who are hypothetically biologically minded, because if we're living creatures, which we clearly are, if we've evolved in the same manner that other living creatures have evolved, which seems relatively indisputable, then how is it that our very existence is somehow antithetical to the flourishing of the biosphere? And you see this sort of thing with this idiot assumption, for example, that bears some of the same hallmarks of this kind of quasi-philosophical thinking, that before the Europeans came to North America, that the natives were living somehow in harmony with nature, and that the entire biosphere was free of the scars of human interaction. And that's utterly preposterous. I mean, the Native Americans were incredibly sophisticated agriculturalists, and the Western Plains Indians burned the prairies constantly to ensure that there was a plentiful supply of the buffalo that they depended on. And so human beings have been affecting the structure of the biosphere ever since we've been around, and that's for a very long period of time. And the idea that there was somehow some pristine state of nature before we emerged on the landscape, and that there's some moral imperative to return to that, it strikes me, it's so incoherent that it's barely comprehensible. And there is something like a hatred for humanity, as far as I can tell, that's lurking underneath this. Hatred for humanity, certainly a hatred for industrialization, and those actually turn out to be the same thing. I mean, one of the things that's really struck me as incomprehensible over the last few years is that, especially on the left, is that you have these joint claims being put forward simultaneously on the left. And one is that we're radically pro-environmental, and we're also the philosophical doctrine that is standing up for the poor and oppressed. And I think, okay, well, what happens when those two things are pitted against each other? We are pursuing these expensive energy policies, and hypothetically, we're supposed to benefit the planet, although we're not, but we are definitely dooming people who are already poor to a much more truncated horizon of opportunity, and to absolute privation and starvation in many cases. In the last 15 years, a surface area totaling 15% of the entire planet has greened. I mean, that is an area that's larger than the continental United States. So let's walk through that for a minute. So just so everyone who's listening is clear, in the last 15 years, the planet has not got less green, it's got more green. And not only a little bit more green, stunningly more green. 15% essentially in 15 years. And that's an area bigger than the continental United States. And that's happened pretty much everywhere in the world. And then you might say, well, where is that happening? And perversely, and contrary to all predictions, it's happening in the drier areas of the planet, especially in semi-arid areas. Plants have to breathe, and to breathe, they have to open pores on their surface. And the problem for plants when they breathe with these pores is that they also allow water to evaporate from their internal structures. And so the less carbon dioxide in the air, the more the plants have to open their pores, and that means the more susceptible they are to drying out. And that means that they struggle to exist in semi-arid areas. Now, what's happened as a consequence of increased carbon dioxide production is that plants can breathe easier, and so they don't have to open their pores to the same degree. And what that has meant is that the very desert areas, at least the semi-arid areas, that the climate apocalypses were claiming would expand and spread, so the desertification of the world, the exact opposite has happened.
We are structured psychologically so that the negative has more impact than the positive does. And that's a very difficult bias to work against when you're in a situation where you might be making the case that the positive should be what's predominating. It's like, well, fair enough, but that isn't exactly how we're wired, and we can be 100% dead, but only so happy. And so it's conservative in some sense, and I don't mean politically, to be a little more hyper alert to the negative than to the positive. But that's a tough thing to fight against when the negative can grab attention, especially when it's blown up to apocalyptic proportions. We'll either subject ourselves to an internal or an external approximation of the apocalypse. And so we can either get our act together, which means to voluntarily subject ourselves to the flaming sword as an individuals, or that will be impressed upon us as a necessity from without. And how intense that will get, we're going to find out, because it's coming very fast. And this is going to be a rough winter. And we've done everything we could to make it rough, because this is, whatever happens this winter is pretty much 100% self-inflicted.